Hi, and welcome back to David Pattinson's Accused Friends. There's been a big focus during this lockdown of the bailouts provided by the government, and this guy Rishi, is at the heart of it, and everyone's saying, Rishi's the hero of the lockdown. But my contention is that the bailouts are a complete and total poison for all of us, and that Rishi is not the hero. He's actually a villain, and I want to use this video to talk about exactly why. So I first became really familiar with bailouts during the 2008 financial crisis. I was living in Southern California, which was the ground zero of the real estate collapse. And I ended up moving to Washington, D.C., where I lived for about 6 years. And, really got a front row seat at how the bailouts totally failed America. And, I want to guard against it happening here. I mean, we had bailouts ourselves then. We were bailing out the banks. Now, we're following the policy of bailing out everyone else. And the big first major disincentive for bailouts is the moral hazard it creates. What it does is it tells companies, if you are financially reckless and gamble with your stockholders' money, you can privatize the profits, but then you can socialize the losses. So if your company does well, makes money, you make money, and that's great. But if you don't do well, the government's going to come in and bail you out. You're not going to be allowed to go bankrupt, and British taxpayers are going to come in and cover your losses, and you yourself are not going to be have your losses covered. So if you have two companies, one's financially reckless, one's financially risk averse and diligent and prudent, this company is not allowed to benefit from the crisis because both companies get bailed out. This company really needs the bailout because it's reckless. This company doesn't need it so much because it's been prudent, but this company is able to take advantage of the fact that it doesn't have to spend all its money on savings and, getting ready for, dark times or a rainy day because British taxpayers are going to come in and bail that company out. So it creates a total moral hazard across the economy, and we become an economy and a country that does not save and just borrows and borrows and borrows indefinitely and gets addicted to cheap money. And that's why we can't even get through 30 days of no economic activity because no one's got any money. Second thing bailouts do is they create a ton of debt. All the money we are using to bail people out has to be borrowed, and then that borrowed money, we have to pay interest on that debt. So we add to our debt, we add to our interest on our debt to bail people out. And we're bailing companies out, we're bailing individuals out, and it's totally, totally wrong. If we didn't bail people out, we would have that money to, which is our money, we would have it to keep, and we wouldn't be having these knock-on effects of greater debt, greater financial vulnerability, and greater interest on debt. So that's a second disincentive. Third thing is it prevents bankruptcy, which is the whole purpose. And it's like, hey, David, we're preventing bankruptcy. This is a great thing, but it's not a great thing because what happens is when companies go bankrupt, new entrants are able to come into the market and they're able to take advantage of the bankrupt company's assets. They're able to buy them at very, very low prices. They're able to get rid of all the debt of the previous company, and then they're able to reorganize and remanage the company in a much more efficient way, which suits the market, suits the customers. And with the previous company that's been bailed out, they have more debt on their books than the new company would, and they're always in need of more stabilization. The government says, well, we've spent all this money bailing this old company out. We need to keep bailing them out to keep them afloat. And the management know, hey, they're just going to keep us afloat. We can just spend what we want to spend. And so it's less efficient for the consumer. The consumers have got to pay higher fees or prices for the old company rather than the new company that comes in. And, you look at a company like Virgin and Richard Branson. Richard Branson and Virgin are getting a bailout through Rishi's program. But of course, in the days where Richard Branson started Virgin, his competitors were not getting a bailout in those days. He was able to take advantage of inefficient competitors and old and out-of-date competitors to get that market share. But of course, when his company is struggling, he doesn't want the next generation of Richard Bransons to come in and take advantage of the broken down market. He wants to preserve his market share. So it's this prevention of bankruptcy is actually a bad thing, and we need to talk about it more Creative destruction is what we need. That's the most efficient case for the market. And, that's something we need to be aware of. Next thing bailouts do is they create a culture of dependence over independence. We're a free people. We need to be, financially secure and financially stable. We don't need to constantly be relying on the government for all our income and, all our sources of livelihood and wealth and security. We've got to do that ourselves. And, this culture of dependence is it's a slippery slope, and it ends, in a very, very ugly way. People become desperate. People become over-reliant on the government. We don't need to be reliant on the government at all. We can look after ourselves. We're the British people. And, people will be contacting me saying, well, David, look, we've got this lockdown. How are people supposed to live during the lockdown? I was totally against the lockdown. The lockdown is unlawful, and the bailouts are totally criminal as well, because you're stealing people's money to give it to them. And, what benefit are they getting? They're having money taken out of one side of their pocket and put in the other side of their pocket. And we're saying this is helping them out, but it's not helping them out. The next point I've got following on from that is inflation, because what's happening, there's all these people sitting at home in lockdown getting paid 80% of their salary, but there's no GDP to back it up. There's no production to back it up. Every pound in your pocket has to be backed up by a pound's worth of GDP or a pound's worth of labour or productive value. But of course, if we're just borrowing money and then we're giving it to people without doing any work, that pound in your pocket is not worth what you think it is. It's worth less. And of course, this also disincentivizes people with actual money in their bank accounts, because all of those people are now losing money through inflation. So anyone who's got money in their bank or money in assets, those, or money in the bank specifically, that money is now worth less because we're borrowing money or we're printing money to recapitalize people without having them provide any GDP in return. The other inflationary point is that, all these healthcare workers are working very hard. They're working at full capacity for their normal wage, whereas everyone else is doing nothing for 80% of their wage. So these healthcare people, key worker people, are going to be saying, well, look, we need a pay rise because, we're doing 100% of the work, but we're only making 20% more money than everyone else relative to our contribution to the economy. So their wages are going to increase, which means everyone else's wages are going to have to increase, which is another inflationary pressure on the economy, and it makes us anti-competitive compared to other countries. So bailouts are going to lead us to higher income tax. And now some people will say, hey, well, look, David, I don't actually pay any income tax, or I don't earn enough income tax to be significant. But of course, you're paying the inflation tax, and you're also paying the tax of opportunity cost. And people say, well, the opportunity cost is just relevant to entrepreneurs that were going to come in to take over bankrupt companies. But you, the citizen, are losing out on the value of lower consumer prices, because these bailed out companies are the least efficient companies. They're the least effective companies. They're not punished for being inefficient. And that non-punishment is going to lead them to charge higher prices for you, the consumer, which is not what we want. So all these bailouts are going to be, they're talked about as being something that's going to save the economy, but they're not going to do it. Because what's going to happen, you think about restaurants, for example, that have been totally devastated by the lockdown. When the lockdown ends, people will say, hey, well, you go back to work. So what's a restaurant going to do? It's going to open up. It's got its bartenders, it's got its servers, it's got its greeters, it's got its bouncers, but it's got no customers. So everyone's going to be there in the restaurant working. They'll have the uniform on. They'll be showing up on time, bright, breezy, but yet there'll be no customers. So what are they going to be doing for 8 hours of the day? They're just going to be standing around chatting to each other. We think about airlines. We're bailing out the airlines. What are airlines going to do when this crisis ends? They're going to go back to flying the planes. They got the pilot, they got the stewardesses, they got the check-in people, they got the baggage people. But who's on the aeroplane? There's no passengers on the plane, because no passengers are going to want to be flying anywhere in case they get the virus. So what we need to be doing is, what we're actually going to be doing, we're bailing companies out, and then they're going to go bankrupt anyway because there's no customers. Why don't they just go bankrupt now, and then all that labour and all that capital can be reassigned to the parts of the economy where it's most needed? Maybe it's needed in ventilators. Maybe it's needed in healthcare services. Maybe it's needed in cleaning services. Maybe it's needed in couples counselling or mental health services, but it's not needed in what was the economy before this crisis happened. It's not needed in hospitality. It's not needed in airlines. It's not needed in cruise ships. So what Rishi's doing is giving all this money to people to prop up the old economy, and then a lot of these companies are going to go bankrupt anyway. What about our taxpayer money? When do we get that back? Well, we don't, because that disappears with the bankrupted company. Surely it's better to hold that money back, let all these companies go bankrupt, and then, the economy can rebound in the most efficient way for the British consumer. So the next point I've got is going to be the fact that this is all going to lead to a much, much, much longer recession than it would otherwise have led to had we had no bailouts. And the recession might technically not last that long, but if it doesn't last that long, it'll be followed by a very, very sluggish recovery, which will almost feel like a recession. High unemployment, high inflation, low growth, all bad things that we don't want, and all caused by Rishi's policy. Why people are calling him a hero, I don't know. I'm certainly not, and hopefully you won't be by the time you finish watching this video. Final point I want to make is the last point about the reasons that bailouts are poison is because it's generational theft. You're borrowing money from young people or the future to prop up existing people or older people or established people. What we need to do is have a fair transfer of wealth through the economy by not spending taxpayers' money of people that are either young, not old enough to vote, not even born, because they haven't had a chance to approve whether they want this money spent. So we borrow money from the future to spend it on the present, and it's the least efficient thing we can do and the most destructive. I just want to finish by giving you a few stats about the current state of the British economy, which are not good. And remember, these stats are us going into the recession. They are not us coming out of the recession. So we currently have a 100% debt to GDP, which means we have twice as much debt as we have as income. British government's taking in about 800 billion in tax receipts a year. We currently have, between 1.5 to 2 trillion in total debt. And you think back to David Cameron, who said, his greatest achievement as Prime Minister was foreign aid. It was giving our money away to foreign countries. Surely the best achievement you could be would be to be bringing money into our country, having other countries pay us. Why can't we be a creditor nation? Why do we have to be a debtor nation? Why do we have to be 2 trillion in the red? Why can't we be 2 trillion in credit? So we have 800 billion coming in per year, but we're spending about 900 billion. So we got budget deficit of about 85 to 100 billion a year, which is 6 times higher than 1970. And our national debt has actually doubled in 10 years, all under a government that calls themselves the Conservatives, but they're not conservative. They're big spenders. We're finally spending 40 billion a year on interest on debt, and that's going to be shooting up, well north of 50, 60, 70 billion a year during this crisis. And, it's a waste. Why can't we have that money for ourselves? Why can't we have that money spent in our economy, creating new jobs, going into people's wages, that money spent on, getting our debt down to zero and getting into credit. But we're borrowing more and more money, we're wasting more and more money, and it's going to lead to lower and lower living standards. So I hope you find this video interesting. I wish it was better news, but, bailouts are not a good thing, and, I want people to start being aware of that. So thanks a lot for watching.